why your brain resists feedback, and how to overcome it. Have you ever felt that sting when someone gives you feedback, whether it's constructive criticism or even a gentle suggestion to improve? It's like your brain immediately throws up a wall, doesn't it? You feel defensive, maybe even a little angry, or worse, you start doubting yourself. But why does this happen? Why do we push back against feedback, even when it's meant to help us grow? The answer lies deep in the way our brains are wired, and understanding this is the key to unlocking your true potential. Today, we're diving into the science, the philosophy, and the psychology of feedback, and, more importantly, how you can overcome your resistance to it. Let's start with the brain itself. Neuroscience tells us that feedback, especially when it's critical, triggers the same regions of the brain that light up when we experience physical pain. Think about that for a second when someone says, "You could do better." Your brain doesn't just hear words, it interprets them as a threat. This is your limbic system, the oldest part of your brain, doing its job. Its purpose is survival, and anything that feels like an attack, whether it's a saber-toothed tiger or a coworker pointing out a flaw, activates your fight or flight response. You're wired to protect yourself. But here's where things get tricky. The brain's resistance to feedback isn't just about survival, it's about identity. Every time you hear criticism, it's like someone is chipping away at the story you've built about yourself. You think, "I'm good at my job, I'm a kind person, I'm smart," and then, suddenly, someone tells you otherwise. Your brain panics. It feels like your identity is under attack, and your natural reaction is to defend it. You might argue back, shut down, or dismiss the feedback entirely. This is why feedback feels so personal. It's not just about what you did, it's about who you think you are. But here's the paradox: the very thing your brain resists feedback is the thing you need most to grow. Think about it. If you only ever listened to what made you feel good, if you only surrounded yourself with people who told you what you wanted to hear, you'd never improve. Growth requires discomfort. It requires facing the parts of yourself that you'd rather ignore. And this is where philosophy comes in.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Let's borrow a page from Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher who famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." What he meant was that true growth, true wisdom, comes from questioning yourself. But how often do we actually do this? How often do we step back and say, "Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I have blind spots. Maybe there's something I don't see." Feedback is the mirror that forces us to examine ourselves. It's uncomfortable, yes, but it's also necessary. Here's a question for you. When was the last time you truly listened to feedback without getting defensive? Be honest with yourself. Did you immediately dismiss it? Did you think, "They don't understand me," or "They're just being harsh"? If so, you're not alone. Most of us default to this mindset because it feels safer. But safety is the enemy of growth. Andrew Huberman, a neuroscientist and advocate of the growth mindset, often talks about the importance of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change and adapt. But here's the catch: neuroplasticity only happens when you challenge your brain, when you step into discomfort and embrace it. So, how do we overcome this resistance to feedback? The first step is awareness. You need to recognize your brain's natural reaction for what it is: a survival mechanism. When you feel that sting, that defensiveness, pause and ask yourself, what am I really afraid of? Is it the fear of failure? The fear of not being good enough? Once you identify the fear, you can start to separate it from the feedback itself. The second step is to reframe feedback as a gift rather than a threat. This isn't just a cliché, it's a mindset shift. Every piece of feedback, no matter how harsh, is an opportunity to learn something about yourself. Even if the feedback is poorly delivered or inaccurate, there's always a kernel of truth that you can use. But you have to be willing to look for it. Here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine you're a sculptor, and your life is a block of marble. Feedback is the chisel. Every critique, every suggestion, every uncomfortable truth, it's a tool to shape you into your best self. But the question is, are you willing to pick up the chisel, or will you leave the marble untouched? In the next part, we'll dive into the growth mindset and explore how to transform your relationship with feedback. But we'll look at practical strategies inspired by both neuroscience and philosophy to turn resistance into resilience. Because the truth is, the way you respond to feedback will determine how far you go in life. The growth mindset: how to turn feedback into your superpower. So, we've established that feedback feels uncomfortable because your brain interprets it as a threat to your survival, to your identity, and even to your sense of worth. But what if I told you that the same mechanism that makes feedback painful is also the key to turning it into your greatest strength? This is where the concept of the growth mindset comes in, a revolutionary idea popularized by psychologist Carol Dweck and echoed by neuroscientists like Andrew Huberman. At its core, the growth mindset is the belief that your abilities, intelligence, and even your personality are not fixed. They can change, adapt, and grow. People with a fixed mindset see feedback as a judgment: I failed because I'm not good enough. But those with a growth mindset see feedback as information: I failed because I haven't mastered this yet, but I can learn. The word "yet" is the key here. It transforms a statement of finality into one of possibility. And that shift, as simple as it sounds, can completely change how you approach feedback and life itself. Let's ground this in science for a moment. Andrew Huberman often talks about neuroplasticity, the brain's incredible ability to rewire itself. When you encounter feedback, especially critical feedback, your brain has a choice: resist and stay the same, or embrace the challenge and grow. Here's the catch: neuroplasticity doesn't happen when you're comfortable. It happens when you're stretched, when you're slightly out of your depth, when you're willing to confront the gap between where you are now and where you want to be. In other words, it's triggered by the very discomfort you're trying to avoid. But how do you make that shift? How do you turn feedback into fuel for growth instead of letting it paralyze you? It starts with reframing your relationship with failure. Most of us are conditioned to see failure as the end of the story, a verdict on who we are. But failure, as Nietzsche famously argued, is not the opposite of success. It's a necessary step on the path to it. He called this the process of becoming. To grow, you must shed old versions of yourself. And this process is messy, painful, and often humiliating, but it's also transformative. Here's an analogy. Imagine you're climbing a mountain. Feedback is the map that shows you where you've strayed off the path. It's not there to insult you or make you feel small. It's there to guide you. But the map is only useful if you're willing to read it. If you crumple it up and throw it away because it hurts to see how far you are from the summit, you'll stay stuck at the base. The growth mindset is what allows you to look at that map and think, I may not be at the top yet, but now I know how to get there. Practically speaking, this means changing how you respond to feedback in real time. The next time someone gives you constructive criticism, notice your immediate reaction. Do you feel defensive? Do you start thinking of excuses? That's your fixed mindset talking. Instead of reacting, try this: pause and breathe. Remind yourself that this discomfort is a sign that you're on the edge of growth. Then, ask yourself 2 questions. What can I learn from this feedback? How can I use it to get better? These questions shift your focus from your ego to your potential. They turn feedback from a threat into a tool. Another practical strategy comes from Stoic philosophy. The Stoics believed in the power of voluntary discomfort, intentionally exposing yourself to challenges so you can build resilience. Think of feedback as mental weightlifting. The more you practice receiving and acting on it, the stronger you become. Start small, ask for feedback on something low stakes, like a hobby or a project. Practice listening without interrupting or defending yourself. Over time, you'll build the mental muscle to handle even the toughest critiques. But here's the deeper question: why is growth worth the discomfort? Why should you subject yourself to the pain of feedback, failure, and constant self-examination? The answer lies in the kind of person you want to become. Imagine your future self 5, 10, or 20 years from now. Are they stronger, wiser, and more capable than you are today? Or are they stuck in the same patterns, avoiding the same challenges, and making the same excuses? The truth is, growth isn't optional. The world is constantly changing, and if you're not adapting, you're falling behind. Feedback is the compass that helps you navigate this change. It's not always easy to hear, but it's always valuable. And the more you embrace it, the more you'll find that the discomfort fades and is replaced by a sense of empowerment. In the next part, we'll dive into the ultimate obstacle to embracing feedback: your ego. We'll explore why your ego fights so hard to protect your sense of self and how you can quiet it to unlock your full potential. Because the reality is, the biggest thing standing between you and growth isn't external criticism, it's your internal resistance. The ego's armor: why letting go of pride unlocks real growth. If there's one thing that stands between us and the transformative power of feedback, it's our ego. The ego is a fascinating yet problematic part of who we are. It's the version of ourselves that clings to an image of perfection, that wants to believe we're already good enough, that resists anything that threatens how we see ourselves. When someone offers feedback, especially the kind that stings, the ego rears its head like a guard dog, barking defensively to protect us from discomfort. But here's the truth: the ego isn't protecting you, it's imprisoning you. Let's unravel the ego's role in resisting feedback. At its core, the ego is driven by fear. It fears being exposed, being wrong, or being less than it wants to believe. When someone says you could improve here, the ego translates this into, you're not good enough. And because the ego is deeply tied to our identity, it feels like an attack on who we are, not just on what we've done. This is why even well-intentioned feedback can feel so deeply personal. But here's the paradox: the ego resists feedback because it's trying to protect your identity, yet it's also the very thing keeping you from becoming the person you want to be. Think about it: if you're unwilling to hear where you need to grow, how can you ever reach your full potential? The ego creates a bubble of comfort, but growth only happens outside that bubble. Philosophically, this struggle between ego and growth has been explored for centuries. Nietzsche believed that to become your Übermensch, your higher self, you must first destroy parts of your current identity. This doesn't mean erasing who you are, it means shedding the layers of pride, fear, and self-deception that hold you back. In a way, growth is a process of ego death. You have to let go of who you think you are to make room for who you could be. But how do we do this? How do we quiet the ego's voice when it tells us to reject feedback? It starts with humility. Humility doesn't mean thinking less of yourself, it means seeing yourself clearly. It's the ability to admit, I don't know everything, I'm not perfect, and that's okay. Humility opens the door to learning because it shifts your focus from defending your current self to improving your future self. Another way to disarm the ego is to separate your actions from your identity. When someone criticizes your work, it's easy to feel like they're criticizing you. But your work isn't who you are, it's just a reflection of where you are right now. and reflections can change. Think of feedback as a snapshot, not a permanent label. When you stop tying your identity to your performance, you free yourself to grow without fear. Here's a tough but important question to ask yourself: what would happen if you let go of pride? What if, instead of trying to prove yourself right, you focused on becoming better? Imagine the weight that would lift off your shoulders if you didn't have to defend your ego every time you heard feedback. Finally, practice gratitude for feedback, even when it's hard to hear. This may sound counterintuitive, but every piece of feedback is someone giving you the chance to improve. It's a glimpse into how others see you, a perspective you can't always see on your own. Instead of seeing feedback as an attack, try to see it as a gift. In the next part, we'll explore how to take actionable steps to integrate feedback into your life effectively. We'll discuss the art of listening deeply, asking the right questions, and turning criticism into a roadmap for personal success. Because overcoming your ego isn't the end of the journey, it's the beginning of transformation. Turning criticism into a blueprint for growth. Once you've quieted the ego and embraced humility, you're ready to do something truly powerful: transform feedback into action. Feedback, after all, is only as useful as what you do with it. Too often, we hear critiques, nod politely, and then let them slip through the cracks of our busy minds. Or worse, we obsess over the negativity without taking any meaningful steps to improve. But feedback's value isn't in the words themselves, it's in how you use them to shape your path forward. The first step to turning criticism into growth is to truly listen. Listening doesn't just mean hearing the words, it means being present, open, and curious about what's being said. When someone offers you feedback, resist the urge to interrupt, explain, or defend yourself. Instead, take a breath and ask yourself, what can I learn from their perspective? Even if the delivery is harsh or clumsy, there's often a nugget of truth hidden inside. Your job is to find it. But listening isn't enough. To make feedback actionable, you need to ask the right follow-up questions. Instead of shutting down or walking away, engage with the person giving you feedback. Ask them to clarify: what specifically could I improve? Or can you give me an example? These questions not only show that you're serious about growth, but they also help you get a clearer picture of what needs to change. Feedback is often vague. Your goal is to extract the details that will guide your improvement. Once you've gathered the information, the next step is reflection. This is where philosophy meets practicality. Take some time to sit with the feedback and ask yourself deeper questions. Is this something I've struggled with before? Have others pointed this out? What patterns can I see in my behavior? Reflection allows you to connect the dots between isolated critiques and the bigger picture of who you are and who you want to become. And then comes the hardest part: action. Feedback without action is like a map without a journey, it's useless. To act on feedback, you need to break it down into clear, manageable steps. For example, if someone tells you that you interrupt others too often, don't just say, "I'll stop interrupting." Instead, create a plan. Next time I'm in a conversation, I'll count to 3 before responding to make sure the other person has finished speaking. Small, specific changes are the building blocks of long-term growth. But here's the thing: action requires consistency. You can't expect to transform overnight. Growth is a process, not a switch. This is where the growth mindset becomes your anchor. Instead of expecting perfection, commit to progress. Celebrate small wins along the way. They're proof that you're moving in the right direction. There's another layer to this that's often overlooked. Feedback isn't just something you receive, it's something you seek out. The most successful people don't wait for others to point out their blind spots, they actively ask for input. This takes courage, but it's one of the most powerful habits you can develop. When you ask for feedback, you show others that you value their perspective and that you're serious about improving. This not only accelerates your growth, but also builds trust and respect in your relationships. Finally, remember that feedback is not a one-time event. It's a continuous cycle of listening, reflecting, and acting. Each time you go through this cycle, you become a little stronger, a little wiser, and a little closer to the person you want to be. So the next time someone offers you feedback, don't see it as a critique, see it as an invitation. An invitation to grow, to evolve, and to take one more step toward your full potential. And now the question you need to ask yourself: what's one piece of feedback you've been avoiding? What would happen if you faced it head on? Because in the end, feedback isn't just about improving what you do, it's about reshaping who you are.